Hey everyone, this is the ESOP guy, and we are on a journey to an ESOP and beyond. And so excited to share this next episode with you. We are going to jump in a little bit deeper to ESOP communication and some of the things I think are really helpful for companies. And Diana Clark has been with us before, and she's on our ESOP team. And this is her primary role in how she goes about helping companies all over the country. I would say kind of enhance their culture with the employee ownership concept. And obviously that takes a lot of communication. So Diana, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Cool. So yeah, so let's just do a quick, I know with you were on before, so this will be your second round, but just for people that are joining and listening to you for the first time, just give us a quick background. Like, how did you get in ESOPs and how did you get to kind of this piece of your career, which is really helping companies on the communication side?
Yeah. So I graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics, and like so many of those in the ESOP space, I didn't know what to do with an econ degree. So my first role out of college was working for a retirement planning firm. I was with American Express, and it was in that space that I learned about ESOPs and really became motivated then to want to work on the HR side. And so as my career evolved, I also ended up getting a master's degree in human resources with a specialty in like training and development. I went on to work as a college administrator for a local community college. And when you are in that space, you get thrown into the classroom. So I ended up teaching a variety of business and economic courses. And then I worked for an employee-owned organization for over a decade in the Northern Indiana area. And so it was really in that space where I had come from, a background in retirement planning, education, and HR, where I feel that I just organically landed here. And my company sold in 2022. And it was at that time that I was inspired to put all those skills to work. And here we are. So I'm able to, use that background in retirement planning and education and as an HR leader to be able to help others through their journey to an ESOP and beyond.
It's awesome. Yeah. So one of the things I know that people say as they get to work with Diana is that it's really helpful because she's been on the other side in terms of like, she knows what it's like to be an employee of a company that has an ESOP. And even though not just being as a C-suite HR exec, but to be part of the group of employees, how much does that help you when you're talking to companies and they're like brand new in an ESOP, or they've been around an ESOP, for maybe a year or two?
Oh, it's so helpful because I think what really inspired me to get here is through my own journey. And so I was with my former executive team when we transitioned to an ESOP. I worked for a family-owned organization in the South Bend, Indiana area. And right after I started in that role, we had the discussions about transitioning to an ESOP for all of the right reasons, for all the same reasons that we hear, to preserve legacy and to give back to the employees that had really helped us get the company to where it was today. And so through that own transition, I was, serving the company, but then I was also an employee owner. So it really impacted me on kind of both sides of the house. And I always tell those, clients that we're working with that I had some pain points in the first couple years post the close of that transaction. And it was actually about 10 years ago when I thought to myself, this is what I really want to be doing post my time with this organization. There really is an opportunity to apply what I learned, the pain points that I had, and also to help others. So, being able to reflect on my own experience and help others has been really beneficial in this process.
No, and that's I think what's great about it. A lot of people that do provide, like me, advice for ESOPs, like I've never been in an ESOP company. So it's just helpful to have that connection, and especially for what you do, which is, helping, if you talk to the people that are running the ESOP or the ESOP committee, or you've been there. So I think that's a really a natural way to go about like helping them, and so I think my next question is just more about, as we get closer to, we're going to get into our main topic, which will be monthly education. Just generally speaking, why should any employee care about having an ESOP? Like, why would that be a movement for them in the right direction?
Yeah, why should they care? Oh, because it really matters. Working for an ESOP company, well, there's so many benefits, and we could talk all day just on the general benefits of working for an ESOP company. But when you're in the employee space and you get to walk through the doors every day, or maybe you work in a remote position and you are connected to something that was greater than it was the week before you were an ESOP, it just makes that connection to something that's greater. And more importantly, you have a chance to help shape the future of the organization through the role that you do. And so at all levels of the organization, what we need employees to know is that their jobs matter. And employees are the heartbeats of the organization. They're what makes that ESOP tick. And so if we can, not only motivate them to understand the value in working for an ESOP company, that's a role. But then in a leadership role, it's our job then to also, educate them on how the company's performance impacts their ESOP benefit. So it really goes both ways.
Mhm. And so from a personal standpoint, what resonates with an employee? Is it, hey, I got more possible wealth in the future? Or is it, hey, I have more control over my destiny than I had before? I think one of the things that happens is the alternative to an ESOP is I could just sell the company to a strategic sale, and the new buyer says, hey, we're not going to, maybe do it this way before, like you guys are doing this way, we're going to do it different, or we're not even going to need your job. That could be something. So what do you think resonates mostly with an employee when they're finally finding out, hey, we just sold this company to an ESOP?
Yeah, I think the first two things that you just mentioned, it's wealth. It's what's in it for me. There's the cash. you
Sure, yeah.
know, that's kind of front and center. But then I think on the control piece, if we talk about just job satisfaction, I think that there's several types of employees. What motivates an employee that incentivizes them through cash, that's kind of one personality type of an employee. But then you have other employees that, yeah, they're motivated by the money and the cash, but they're also motivated by making a difference. They're motivated through having greater job satisfaction at work. And so when you kind of combine those two things, then I think you have kind of the best of both worlds when it comes to employee engagement.
Mhm.
Being able to articulate that to them on what the ESOP is, how it benefits them. So we talk about a lot of different factors and how that drives employee engagement.
Yeah, and that's something that I think and this is something we've talked about before, but in the industry, the rule of thumb, it seems like for the engagement of employees, once an ESOP is closed, is usually like people say, well, it takes about 3 years for that really engagement to start to happen. And I think the reason they say that is because, if I was the employee and I'm operating from a what's in it for me type of mentality, which is just kind of normal, I'm looking at the participant statement and I'm saying, all right, I have this many shares this year. Okay, I got shares, great, but whatever. And then the next year you get another group of shares and that's worth something. And then so maybe in the third year, they really start to see the impact of those shares compounding. I think that's the rule of thumb, but what are your thoughts along that as far as what the expectation is for employee engagement? And then we'll talk about like what it could be.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I hear from a lot of company leaders that there's just nothing to really talk about in those first few years. And, so my perspective is that don't delay. And,
Mhm.
here's why. Because when you invest the time into making this ESOP transaction happen, and then you make this rollout statement that we're now an ESOP, and you don't ever circle back to it, you lose an opportunity from day one to not really hone in on driving employee communication and education. So you miss out on those opportunities. And more importantly, like the return on investment that we want to be having with these companies as employees too, is we want to start talking about, why is education and communication important? Because it helps align business goals. Now that we're an ESOP, we're going to continue to operate the company as we always have. But now as employee owners, we need to educate them really on what our goals are and how do we get to those goals. And by working on communication and education topics, by taking the time to do that too, we're also missing we want to be sure that we are not missing out on opportunities to drive things like continuous improvement and innovation. So don't delay. Don't delay.
Yeah, don't delay. And I think partly it's always going to be, in my opinion, different because every company has like their own culture, like a personality. That company has a culture, a personality, and you kind of have to work with that culture. It's not like you can take something and, like, for instance, if a company doesn't even have any idea like continuous improvement or some other cultural initiatives, then we're trying to like get them to do something that they're not typically going to do, right? So part of it is to really respect, hey, that culture. The ESOP is an enhancement to a culture, so it's more like how do we grow all that together? But coming back to the rule of thumb, I think the main thing is I do believe in just from my own perspective of being the CEO of our company for 10 years and just dealing with a lot of clients on strategic planning, different things like that. I do believe communication is such a critical element of changing the rule of thumb. And that what I mean by that is I believe that there is so much more return on investment for an employee stock ownership plan for a company than waiting for 3 years. And
Absolutely.
that's kind of where I feel like we can go. And you have had some great experience in, as of late with companies that are looking at, they just closed and now, hey, let's do it differently. So one of the things I know that, you're looking at is like some clients are looking at this or companies saying, hey, let's do a monthly educational program, so what obviously inherent is like, if I can do a monthly, I create more frequency. I am doing a lot more than just waiting for 1 year. So let's talk about the general idea. Like, number one, what does it mean to have a monthly ESOP education plan?
Yeah. So, and how fun is it to build a monthly education plan? So when we think about the more traditional ways that we announce the ESOP, we tend to do them in a larger forum. We make that big announcement. And during those initial announcement pieces, the company talks about the why behind the transaction. And then we usually partner with individuals like us in the field or other communication specialists to talk about plan details. But when employees and their executive leadership teams come together for the first time and talk about the ESOP, it's often that like they're pulling off that Band-Aid and we're an ESOP and there's this now what moment. But employees, when they hear about that ESOP for the first time, they're also getting these like plan details and other information that's coming to them that they just don't always hear all the big takeaways. And so when we talk about like, what can we do from that initial outreach thereafter to really educate on the ESOP, what we want to do is just take an approach of collaboration. So for example, in a typical rollout meeting, we'll talk about the why, we'll talk about, these are the plan details, and this is what vesting means per se, right? But then if we do, and we build like a monthly lunch and learn program for somebody, we might take those plan details then, and we might recapture what vesting is and go through the schedule. But then it's really important to collaborate with the leaders and say, well, let's talk about why vesting is really important. It's important that we attract and retain high functioning employees. That's part of the reason why we have a vesting schedule, is because the cost of a mishire, And the cost of employee turnover is just that. It's really costly to companies. And so, vesting is more about just the schedule and you have to stay and this is how much you get into your account. But there's reasons why vesting is important to companies. And so those are the conversations that we want to be having, post some of these initial concepts.
Yeah. So from this is where I think it gets interesting when you talk about communication, because I think one of the things I see is that the people I deal with, the front end of the deal, are mostly the shareholders. And then, of course, then I'll start dealing with some key people. And then eventually you have the whole population of employees. And when you get involved, what you're dealing with directly, you're probably the person in front of the employees at the first meeting. And then from there, you're back and forth with maybe the key leadership group, like, hey, this is what we want to try to accomplish.
Yeah.
And so when you go through that, like, idea of like how people, like, first off, what's important to the employee, what's important to the shareholder, what's important to the key employee, and then what's important to the employee. Those are obviously different things, and you're trying to kind of communicate at all those different levels.
Yes.
So as you say, like, the vesting could be something to talk a lot more about, I guess, for the general population. So how does that message change with people you talk to, number one, and then specifically too, just getting into like, what other areas would you want to, if you kind of had a 12-month plan, what would you kind of cover in those monthly meetings, to get the engagement? I mean, specifically, this is for the engagement to get it up, right?
Yeah, yeah. So if we kind of said, hey, what are the things that we should be talking about? If we really dissect all the basics, we talked about, vesting, we talk about plan rules, we talk about terminology like contributions and allocations. And then, breaking those apart into like one topic meetings. And what I love about our lunch and learn programs is that they're quick topics and we make them fun. It's in more of a casual setting. And so you're listening to a one topic session over the course of, 25 to 30 minutes. We allow for a lot of Q&A. And then we also, that kind of platform too, also allows leadership to join those conversations and kind of add their own commentary to it. And then, when we get out of what I would call the more technical pieces of what your ESOP plan, looks like and its design, then you can get into some of the more engagement pieces. And so, for example, we have a organization that we're working with right now, where probably 80% of their workforce is 30 years of age or younger. And so when they first heard about the own retirement. So, when we talk about this is a retirement benefit, they just kind of zone out. And so we have to find a way then to talk more about, like, how do you generate wealth? How do you build wealth for you and your family long term? So that might be a conversation about, what does the average 401k balance in America looks like? What do you think, as a 30-something, what do you think that you need to retire on? And most people, those are interactive sessions, and most employees will say, well, I don't know. I think I might need, 500,000 or $1 million, or, 100 million or $1 million or whatever.
100 million.
Yeah, it's all over the board, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But we can say, hey, look, just this quarter, Fidelity and Vanguard Investments say that those that are in the Z generation, they actually need like 1.6 million to retire. And
Okay.
your average 401k account right now is probably only $25,000 or $30,000. So how are you going to get there? And this ESOP, this vehicle, is a really good way to help bridge that gaps. So some of the programming that we put together can be designed for your workforce. I like to ask those in leadership positions, what's the real word on the street? What are employees really saying? Are they thinking that it's fluff? And then let's address those things.
Yeah, I think there's I had a client that I did an interview with recently, and we were talking a little bit about the idea that some people don't even trust that this is real.
Yeah.
Like, first off, like, this ESOP is like something they haven't heard of before. And then, so you start off with that understanding what it really is. And then you go through that. I guess there's a stage where they just start to kind of like, they're just skeptical. I'm sure a population of people are just are generally skeptical. Like this is just another thing that the company's going to do. And they don't really maybe even trust that as people. So how do you directly deal with the skeptics that, maybe in the first year, and, is it just take time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of my former workforce had, well, half of it was male workforce, 25 to 30-year-olds. And every day they would, at lunch, they would be on DraftKings making their bets, or they would be talking about Bitcoin. And so when they would give me a hard time about, what we were doing with the ESOP, I would just say, hey guys, look, you guys understand what Bitcoin is. I said,
Mhm.
ESOPs are really abstract too, but it's no different. So what we have to do is just teach them the concept
Mhm.
and show them a vision of what it can be.
Yeah, I love that. So yeah, I kind of meet them where they are anyways at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's challenging too, just in general, because you have like every company, depending on how many employees they have, they're going to have demographics that are just different, right? So you have all the generational, differences between baby boomers, Xers, Zers, I don't even know, millennials. You've got we have a lot of clients we've closed their deals and they have Spanish speaking people, so you have this 50% speak Spanish and then the other, I mean, so it's like, how do you, I mean, you're in a cool job, but it's hard. Like, how do you fit all of the differences into your style? Like you got these 25 to 30-year-old males and they're talking about Bitcoin, right? So how do you work that into the monthly educational meetings? And if, or are you just trying to like blanket across and hope to hit everybody?
Yeah, no, another really good question. How do we design programming to be a one size fits all when we only have 30 minutes a month to do it? And I would say that the best response there is that you just don't, because not everything is a one size fits all.
Hmm.
But what I think the best strategy is to collaborate with the organization to get an ideal for, what their workforce is. What does the workforce do? Um, what are they making widgets? Are they people that are working in advising groups? And then you can kind of tailor, your messaging, your frequency of messaging, and how it gets delivered, considering some of those factors. And we have, in my former organization, we had 13 different offices. So we had half of our employees were remote, half of them were working in the manufacturing facilities, and then half of them were servicing patients. So I came from a healthcare organization. And so what I find works best, is that you do a little bit of everything. There's some generations that still like handouts and pamphlets.
Mm.
There's others that really like Teams channels with a dumping ground of where they can go to get resources. Other employee groups like to play games and activities, so it helps reinforce that learning. And others just like, information delivered to them in 25 or 30-minute kind of glimpses. We're in a generation where people love podcasts. They can get
Hmm.
great information quickly at their fingertips while they're driving down the road. So, our strategy is really more holistic to try to, reach each and every one of those employee groups.
Yeah, I think that is the key, right? Is to try to be as creative as you can, because you're right. There's no way you can do everything for every single person in the company, but at the same time, it gives us an opportunity to try. And I think,
Absolutely.
that the one word that keeps kicking in my mind is just creative. Be creative with your communication and try a lot of things. And I think the one thing about this podcast episode today is really just about, I think what we're talking about is the frequency of how much you engage people in the concept of employee ownership. And this idea that, well, I think that there are some people that are thinking like there's not much to talk about, as you've kind of said already, but because there's such an opportunity to be creative with multiple ways to go about it, like with what you just described, then at the same time, you can program something. I think the problem is people aren't really prepared for this. and they're not proactively programming, the year. Like, hey, this is what we're going to do. Let's adjust accordingly. But maybe they're planning other things like, hey, we're planning our new renewal of insurance, right? They're planning stuff already. So I think it needs to, in some sense, get in everybody's head. Like, this is definitely something you should plan every year, whether you're brand new ESOP or you've been an ESOP for a couple of years, or you've been an ESOP for 20 years. What are you doing next year and how are you planning it? And I think that what we're saying is, like, you definitely should be thinking about more frequency and more creativity and just being, and that can help, sometimes it's just get everybody on board and come up with some workshops and figure out what the best way to do that is, or have somebody like Diana help, but those are things I think that kind of where we're landing is, like, those are ideas that just are helpful, right?
Yes, very helpful in building yourself out, what I would call like a one-page, ESOP strategic plan. And frequency is important, but quality is more important. And so, considering your bandwidth, you don't have to do it alone. But if you said, our goals this year are going to be doing like a one time a quarter ESOP program, that's year one. That's fantastic. We can help you build that out, or you can do it yourself, but set that as your goal. Maybe year two, as you start to do some bi-monthly programming. So now you've got some 6 programs. But to the point of creativity, there's so much opportunity to talk about your ESOP in what's already happening in your general operations. And as we're, taping our podcast here at the end of August and September, I'm thinking about, in Q4, what some companies might be going through in terms of their employee benefit package. And so a lot of organizations have a health insurance renewal, come January 1st, that's when the new health plan starts. But Q4 is when they're really, kind of putting all that work together. So when we think about a common term called employee open enrollment, where benefits are due, people have to fill out their paperwork. That's an opportunity for the company to talk about, what is a total compensation statement. And as we're thinking about our health insurance renewal for 2025, as a leader, we can be talking about, the impact and value of the importance of having a really good employee benefit package and what that means as an ESOP company. But as an ESOP company too, it also means that we are mindful of how we're spending our dollars on employee programs and employee benefits. And so those are conversations that we could be having as leaders in everything we do. And so if you like that idea, use that, this coming fall. And when we think about, the term total compensation and what that really means to an employee, that means for every dollar that they put in their pocket from a wage, the company spends another, maybe it's another 25% of that dollar to keep that employee on payroll, to pay the taxes, to pay their benefits. And oh, by the way, what's the value of the ESOP? And so if you have a mature plan, or maybe you're in year 2 or 3 with your ESOP, you're now able to look at what that cash value, what that cash benefit of that ESOP is, and you can help that employee understand, what the benefit of that is too. So I guess our point is just that there's so many opportunities. It just takes some creativity and some thought into what you're doing in your operations and trying to align it throughout the year and how we talk about the ESOP and what drives that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think that's part of just being continuous improvement minded around, like, hey, we can always do something better, like, than we are doing, right?
Absolutely.
And not
Yeah.
to say that, there are some companies that are doing this phenomenally well on their own, and there's others that are just starting. And so part of the topic today is just to get some of those thoughts on the table, or at least gear up. It's a good timing, I think, too, because we're getting closer to the fourth quarter. Then you can start really thinking about 2025's plan. And so I think that the timing of this episode is really helpful. So one thought I was going to get more, I was going to get a little deeper into some of the things that a couple of things, like some of the things you would get into on monthly education categorically, right? So for an employee, one of the thoughts I had is they got to feel a sense for, like, how do they contribute to building the value of their own ESOP plan. Like, so if I had to kind of compare that to a business owner, should know how they build value in their company, right? They should know that, if the company is going to grow in profitability, that's going to be good for them, those kind of things. So are you seeing some of that type of thing come about in your monthly educational lunch and learns?
Yes, we're starting to see more of that. And I think that that topic, I would put that in the employee kind of financial literacy bucket there. And that's really an initiative from leadership or management to help employees understand how their role directly impacts the company's bottom line. And so when we talk about employee impact and job performance, those are collaborative conversations for sure that we're having with company leadership. So we're having not only those types of conversations, and I would say that those are kind of elementary, right? We pitch the ideas, but then the second round of that is, hey, we might then just carve out a team of customer service professionals and have then like a mini workshop with them along with their leadership team to talk about, innovation, process improvement, purchasing, customer service. We can really get into that then on a deeper level.
Oh, I like that idea. Yeah. So yeah. So when you start thinking about, I always kind of think about the big picture, like how does this like help the company? How do you help the company grow? But if you do break it down in departments like that, you could probably come up with, maybe they don't even have KPIs that they're following, like the customer service department. So maybe it'd be like, hey, let's create some KPIs, let's measure those, and get that level of business acumen going in regards to, departments. So I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, we do a lot of I call it like a company scorecard, and it really is that KPI. I would like to see leaders do more of that for those departments because employees want to help. They want to be helpful. They want to know, what the rules are and how they can, maximize that ESOP benefit. But they can't drive performance if they don't know what the score is or if they don't know, what those opportunities are. So I think as leaders, if we're willing to, sit down with them and carve those out and show them how they can make an impact, it goes a long way.
Yeah, and that's just a good business practice anyways, right? But the reason this is tagged to the ESOP is that they get a stake in the
Yeah,
value creation. So
yeah.
it just naturally fits into, we should be doing, these different things. One thing that comes up, I think, for some companies that are afraid of, they think we're talking about open book management, but we're not talking about open book management. I think you can do all of this type of communication without saying, hey, we're gonna open up our financial books to you guys. And I think that's something people ask me all the time. And I'm like, some companies do that, and that's cool. Like they're open book management companies. Others are like closed book, that's fine. But what we're talking about really is about understanding the dynamics in financial literacy as far as like your example of customer service. How does that impact this, right? Ultimately, it is, you're going to see that in the share price. So eventually you're going to see the benefit of all that in the share price. But if you break it down to by department, then you're not really dealing with, hey, here's everything that you're going to want to look at. So, and is that something that comes up in your conversations with the leaders? And then how does that come across from the employees?
Yeah, I think leaders post the transaction phase. I think they know that somewhere along the way, they're going to have to address like, how are we going to be talking about company financials in the coming year? What's our obligation? Do we have to show everybody the book? So I find that we have a lot of kind of exploratory conversations and they sound like, well, what are you doing now? Are we releasing targets and goals? Have you ever talked about company financials? And so the way to start with that, I like to put it in, just very basic terms is, let's start with some KPIs and let's just create a vision of where we're headed and give employees, kind of enough direction on how to hit those targets. And then on the financial piece too, again, those can be very confidential conversations for years to come, but employees are curious about what those numbers are. And so, I guess our kind of guidance items to them is to start releasing what the goals are and then give feedback on those goals. So if, our goal over growth is 10% what it was for last year, check in with employees and say, hey, our goal was 10% growth. We're only at 5% from where we are last year. This is what we need to do to meet our targets over the next 6 months, is to
Mhm.
just, start making ways to, start laying breadcrumbs so you can have those conversations.
Yeah. And I think trying to break down a scorecard is the best way to do it, because you need to make it relevant to the position. There's nothing more, frustrating for somebody like, hey, yeah, we need to grow profitability, but they're only, they're obviously contributing to profitability, but only at that level of what they can control. And
Yes.
so it almost works better just to drive into the customer like service department, or the sales department, or the manufacturing department, and reflect the scorecards around the things that they can control,
Yeah.
and build budgets and goals around those KPIs, as opposed to just the bigger financial goals that we can kind of get stuck into. So strategic planning, I think for an ESOP company, can look a lot like strategic planning for a non-ESOP company, but it can be a lot more powerful because you're able to drive into each of these departments with scorecards and make it meaningful to them. And I think that's kind of part of the idea behind what true financial literacy looks like for an ESOP company.
Yes, we had a larger purchasing department, and so on the purchasing side, they definitely have a huge impact on their purchasing power and savings. And so that's, from a company's perspective, we can work with departments like that and show cost savings from year over year too. So those are things that as leaders, we don't want them to be afraid to get in there and do that, but that's really what's going to help those employees understand what kind of impact they can make.
Right. Yeah. And celebrate those successes and victories, again, more frequently than just, hey, here's your participant statement. So, and that's kind of where we're leaning into right now, is how do you have more conversations about this in a way that is going to move the dial a little bit farther, a little bit quicker, a little bit stronger than you have in the past, with just, once a year type of meetings. So.
Yeah, they've worked really well. We can talk to employees in larger groups about kind of the overarching benefits of ESOPs, but then we can also work with, organizations to have more of these like micro conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So as you go through the different things that you've seen, so is there anything with an employee meeting that this is just kind of like something that people, I'm sure, think about, that have you been in a position where it got super uncomfortable? Like, because you got into a topic, let me just say it, like some employees might be super outspoken, right? And they may ask some really, really um, bad question, and not sense, in the sense of like opening a topic that's just uncomfortable for whomever it might be. They may be like, hey, well, they might be asking about compensation or things that are just, not something you want to get into, like in an open forum. Have you run into stuff like that? And then I guess the deeper question is, how do you prepare? I think sometimes people have anxiety of having these employee meetings because they don't want to get like into a difficult, awkward situation.
Yes, whenever, yes, whenever you put employees in a room together and you get, all sorts of dynamics around the room, there's always an employee or several that ask the inappropriate questions. And so I would say almost every time we meet with employees, somebody's going to ask. A lot of employees, I think, are just genuinely curious about the money. Like,
Mm-hmm.
hey,
Yeah.
this is supposed to benefit me, but we think it's going to benefit you more. What did you sell the company for? I think the best thing that we can do is to help our leadership teams know that these questions are coming,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to just prepare some mindful responses to the more difficult questions, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Because there's a sense of culture too, in that like some companies are more transparent. Like, hey, we'll just whatever, we'll just share with it, whatever. And others are like, no. And part of it, you can get what I think the biggest issue is you can get so sidetracked on something that's a tangent that's not really that important, but an employee might make a big deal out of it. And I think the idea of having a mindful response is helpful to de-escalate that so that you can get back to the main thing. The main thing is this is 100% benefit to you. You're not putting any cash into this.
Yeah.
As long as you work here, you get this benefit. I think one thing that has popped up in my head on meetings with companies is, the sense of like we're, as employees, we're at risk of something. Like they feel like there's some conspiracy or there's some kind of, risk of something happening. And it's hard for me because I'm like, well, you didn't put anything into it. There's always business risk. So I always kind of get to that point. I'm like, well, maybe we need to put that on the side and say, hey, we'll have a one-on-one with you. Or, so what would some of those mindful responses be, that people are, prepared for that kind of thing if they engage people at this level?
Yeah, I think the most common question is always about the money. Like, what did the company sell for, or are we going to have access, to the financials? And I think a really mindful response would be, as a leader, we know that this information is important to employees. So simply saying, hey, we know this is important to you, and we have a plan over time to become more transparent with the numbers. And this is what that could look like. So for example, next year, we are committed to putting up the company scorecard, which means that we're going to have two numbers that we're going to track. We're going to track a profitability number. We're going to track a sales goal. And we want you to be part of that. And here's what that looks like. And then, maybe in year 2 and 3, we're going to actually start talking about, we're going to talk more about the EBITDA. That's a really important number to start talking about and how we get to that. So a mindful response is, letting employees know that leadership understands that this is important to them, and then offering a plan to address that. And what does that plan look like in the years to come?
Yeah. I think I would say too, just to boil it down, being prepared is going to be really important for that. And that's one of the reasons I brought up the topic on the awkwardness, because then if you are prepared and you work through it, then you're going to have more of these meetings. If you're not prepared and you get blown up, you're not going to have these meetings anymore. And you're like, I'm done. And that's going to be counter to the whole ESOP concept. Like we got to engage people in conversation. Like if we don't, we're going to be in this position of like, nobody knows what's going on. And so we want it to be a positive thing. And I think that's part of realizing. I would say that one of the reasons we're doing this episode too is because I think that there's a sense for some companies like, hey, I can just do this. Like this will just happen because we're such a good company, and all those things are good. And I wouldn't say anything negative about that, but there might be, hey, we're a little bit overestimating our ability to navigate through ESOP communication because we're good at this other stuff. And what I'm saying is that because there are a lot of nuances to it, it's really helpful to have people help you go through this until you get to through that learning curve. And you're like, yes, we got this. And so that's my concern and then you try something, it blows up and you're like, oh my gosh, let's not do anything else. Let's just go back to doing what we did before. So that's kind of the part of my thought process is I want to help people think about this proactively, make sure you got the right, and this is just to me as important, if anything, of doing a good transaction. Like, if you don't do this well, then some of the elements of what you did the transaction for start to kind of fade away.
Yes. And to your point too, what we often see is just bandwidth. So the transaction happens, and then perhaps some of the people that were involved in the transaction then end up taking on maybe some ESOP administrative responsibilities or communication responsibilities. But those folks go back to their full-time jobs. And so this becomes kind of a secondary piece to the operations. It's a very important piece, but it's just additional kind of work then that kind of gets baked into their job. And so at that point too, when you're assuming new responsibilities, you kind of don't know what you don't know. you might have a really great vision, but that bandwidth, how do we come up with programming and how do we execute it? That can be really challenging in and of itself. And then, we were just kind of talking about those that, I call it like they don't always drink the Kool-Aid. So,
Exactly.
when we really think about our programming, we want to be sure too that we're hitting, I call it kind of a bucket process. So we want to make sure that we're checking something off of a bucket that talks about business and financial literacy, that we've got some things baked in there on culture and team building. We're talking about innovation, and then we're just providing general education on this is your ESOP plan. These are the rules, and this is how it works and how it applies to you. So I think when you look at all of those things, it doesn't happen overnight. And if we can talk about, what is the best practice, it's really to just build out a plan that you can look at as a runway for up to a year, and then nurture that plan and then measure it. After you've had 6 or 12 months of programming in place, measure that programming, elicit feedback from employees, make sure that they understand that the ESOP benefits them and how it benefits them. And then don't hesitate to deviate from your programming if you need to make some adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one thing about measuring is so important, whether you're an ESOP or not anyway, but an engagement survey that helps
Yes.
to kind of, I remember thinking through, like, I got on a bell curve, I've got my actively engaged people that are just like, so they're the cheerleaders of the company, right? They're way over here on the one side of the bell curve. Then you have your way on the other side of the bell curve, your actively disengaged people. And I would call them the toxic people, right? They're probably not needing, they shouldn't even be there, to be honest with you, because they are never going to move off the dime, because they are just, for whatever reason, they're not good. They're there for the wrong reasons. And then you have your big bell curve, and you have everybody in between. And I think the goal is, as you measure engagement surveying, is to see where your population is and start moving the people you can, obviously, to the right as far as you can. And I think that, like, your point of measuring is important, because if you don't measure, you're going to be guessing at this all the time. And there are a lot of places you can get these surveys. I know Diana can recommend different things, to companies. But the bottom line is definitely, if you're going to do something, measure it and see if it's going to have an impact on the company.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's your score. It's your report card as well.
That's right. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
the job. I think job one coming out of the gate is, like, figure out what it is and start measuring the engagement, and hopefully you're seeing, year after year success with that. And if you're not, then you just need help, because this is the job, is getting people excited about it and engaged, and wanting, if they are actively engaged, then they're going to tell everybody they know about it. And it's just going to be a good cultural thing. It's the same thing with people that don't like it, or they're going to just tell everybody they don't like it. And so you're constantly battling, internal communication in the process. One thing I wanted to say too is just, like, what we're talking about, what I think Diana and I are talking about, this may just be me, in my opinion, but this is really, in my opinion, cutting edge ESOP stuff. You're not seeing companies do this on a monthly standpoint. What Diana is doing is, in my opinion, is cutting edge, because it is pushing the envelope towards things that you're not seeing as a standard best practice. And, and it's called 2024, 2025. I think in the next 3 years that you're going to see more and more what we're talking about becoming a reality. But the reality is, what I was saying earlier, is that the rule of thumb is, hey, we'll just kind of wait for the next couple of years. The message at the end is this: don't wait, get going, and don't be kind of like reactive, be proactive. And those are things I think are going to be super helpful. And it's stuff like Diana's doing is really contributing a lot to, I think, changing the mindset for the ESOP industry.
Yeah.
So thank you. So any last words that you would say for people that are thinking about this, or, in those different stages?
Yeah. Don't delay, and if you're really struggling, I think, to get some concepts or some programming in place, don't hesitate to reach out. Of course, we would love to help you, but there's so many fantastic resources in the ESOP community. as well that can serve as an inspiration. But again, don't delay, because you're just missing opportunities to grow and engage your workforce and align your goals. But think of this too as being a process of, how do we be executive leaders for ESOPs? And I think that that's really what, it kind of boils down to, is that there's a lot of leadership momentum behind it, a lot of creativity, and ultimately we just want to impact the bottom line. We want employee engagement to impact the bottom line.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you again for your time today.
Of course. Happy to be here.
So for everybody else, thanks for joining today. We are excited to continue to share more resources and topics with you. If you do have questions about anything related to ESOP, whether it's pre-close, post-close, please, link up with us on our website at journeytoanesop.com, and we'll be happy to reach back out to you. So with all that, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you on our next step on this journey to an ESOP.